our history. Buildings and people and memories and dreams. Who better to tell us than those who were there? There's so much to learn from the stories they'll share. Living history. Living history.
Welcome to Living History with Ted Goldsboro. Today we have Helen Porter Dixon with us, and we're going to be talking about the Gladwin Colony, which was owned by a Dr. Seymour DeWitt Ludlam. It was on Mill Creek Road and Rose Glen Road. And we're going to learn about the history of Dr. Ludlam's sanitarium. Helen, could you, on this map, could you sort of show me where things were? Like, here's the river, and where was your store?
Our store was right at Mill Creek Road, and when you came along River Road and you made a left up Mill Creek Road, you were only going a short distance. And as soon as you started going, it was uphill and around a curve. The colony started there. The colony was all different buildings. And as you were coming up Mill Creek Road, on the right-hand side was the laboratory, they called it. And on the left-hand side was quarters. That's where all the black laborers, they did the kitchen work, the laundry, and cooking, and so forth. And then you went a little further and came down to where Rose Glen Road comes in, but on the right-hand side of that were two more buildings. The first one was called the Mill. That's where the worst of the male patients were. And then the second one, no, I'm wrong. Beg your pardon. It was the guardhouse. The Mill was the next building where my mother worked, and she worked there from 1928 until roughly around 50. And so,
what did she do?
She was a nurse. She was came from Scotland. She was a nurse in Scotland, maternity nurse. And when she came to this country, she would have had to go through additional kind of training to be a maternity nurse in a hospital here. So she didn't do that. She worked at the Mary Drexel Home for Crippled Children. And from there, when the Depression came, she was coming, everything was getting, she got laid off and heard about the job at Dr. Ludlam's and applied there. I think it was in the newspaper that she heard about it.
Okay.
And
what were those buildings before they became Dr. Ludlam's?
They're all part of various mills. They were manufacturing around there, but all had closed down. And the workers that worked in the mills lived in these various houses, except the one that was right on the road at the bottom of, when you come down Rose Glen Road, before you turn either left or right on Mill Creek, was called the Inn. And that was a, that's it there. It, in the old days, you could tie your horse up front, and the rails were still there back in the day, and you could rent a room, wayfarers, travelers.
Like a hotel,
yeah,
sort of.
kind of. And
was that also at one time a post office for Rose Glen?
I don't know that.
Okay.
I had not.
I think there was a train station on the Reading way back when
there,
called
yeah,
Rose Glen.
Rose Glen.
So there was a little community there now, which there may be two houses left.
Left, yeah.
Okay.
But in here is where they would, the Dr. Ludlam made this.
Good.
His office, the offices where you first went in, and the reception area, and then on the second floor, he had some patients if they had not been evaluated yet. They put them there, and then once they were evaluated, he knew which building to send them to. And then on the third floor were the help, the aides, and other nurses and so on lived there, because everybody in the day, when my mother first went to work there, she made $30 a month room and board. That's $1 a day. And she only had Thursday and every other weekend off. And so that's the kind of money that was being made then in those days.
So some of the people lived, or a lot of the people lived in the grounds. On the grounds.
Most all of them did. Even the black people that worked in the kitchen and so on, they lived up at quarters. There was a big place up there, and they all 2 or 3 in a room and whatever. But that's how they had to live.
And what about eating?
They ate in the buildings where they worked.
Okay.
When the food was brought over in carriers to where my mother worked, there was enough brought there for her and her patient helper. She had a patient that used to help her all the time.
Now, why were people there? What patients? What?
This was an insane asylum, and people that had severe nervous breakdowns. There were people there from all over the world that came to Dr. Ludlam's because he was a renowned psychiatrist in Philadelphia, and that's where his main office was. And he was connected with one of the big hospitals in town. I'm not sure which just now. But my mother had, in her building, the mill, she had 18 of the worst.
For one?
One nurse. But this was 8 hours. You had 3 nurses, round the clock. And her job was to get them bathed, and most of them stayed in pajamas all the time. And but she was successful in getting a couple of them to where you could trust them, and they would talk with you. Sometimes a little bit sensibly, but then others not. And some of them were really dangerous. She was attacked quite a few times. But she was a strong woman, big built, and sometimes she had to have help, and the men would come from the mill, guardhouse over to help. And the same thing over there. They would holler, help, and she would go and help them with the men sometimes.
Okay. These different buildings then would have patients with different disabilities?
Yes, different stages of insanity.
Okay.
Some when they were in the mill or the guardhouse, the male or female, they never went anywhere else. They never got better from there and were moved anywhere. That just didn't happen.
Would some of them be allowed outside? Could they walk around the grounds?
Yes, there was. If you went up Rose Glen Road across the bridge, before on the left-hand side up on the hill was a place called the Towers, and that's where they had a big reception room there, and sometimes they would have parties, and they did needlepoint and crocheting and stuff, and some of the patients from the other buildings were allowed to walk over by themselves, or they had an attendant walking with them to take them there.
I see.
And that was also the building that they did the shock treatments in. He was one of the first to start the shock treatment.
Electric shock for the brain. Okay.
Yes.
I see here we have an obituary, and I think he must have died around 1956, I think. And was his son involved?
Junior. I called him Junior.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
Seymour DeWitt Jr.
What happened to the Gladwin colony toward the end of all the buildings? What happened? The son take over?
The son took over for a time, and then he got sick himself. And as far as I know, he was in Bryn Mawr Hospital. And from there, I really don't know what happened. The place, as far as I know, buildings were sold off individually, and some were rented.
I see.
By for friends. You may have known one of the men that rented one of the buildings further up Rose Glen Road. There was about 14 or maybe 10 to 14 buildings altogether.
And eventually, most of them were torn down.
Yes. If they weren't torn down, they were falling down anyway because from disrepair and stuff like that.
So, as far as we know, Dr. Ludlam's mother's house
It's still
still
standing,
there,
yeah.
along River Road, Mill Creek Road.
Mill Creek Road.
And then Rose Glen Road has a building or two going up the hill.
On the right-hand side.
Okay.
There are a few left.
I think one of those that my friend Hamill Horn lived in, I think it was a dormitory.
It wasn't actually a dormitory. There were a couple of nurses lived in that building. And the building below it, there were a couple of male nurses lived in there. And they had their own kitchen and, you know, they could, whatever bedroom arrangements that they had, there would be 2 or 3 living in there.
Okay. I'm familiar with an artist named Alice Neal, who I'd understood a few times had tried to commit suicide, and she was a patient here for 2 or 3 months, but she evidently was not a danger to anyone, and she lived with the Ludlums on the 3rd floor of that stone house that's still there.
Wow.
And eventually she was fine and went out and continued to paint and became pretty well known as an artist.
How about that?
Alice Neal. We were talking about one of the buildings belonging to the Egbert, and then later I think Chadwick. Dr. Ludlum, I believe, bought most of these buildings around 1910, 1914. He opened this, so it lasted until maybe the 1950s.
Yes, that's about right.
And your mother worked there until 1950?
Yes.
Okay. And she left to go back to the store.
To take care of the store because I could no longer take care of it.
Road.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
That's that Chadwick that you talk about. One of the buildings was called Chadwick. When you went over the bridge going up Rose Glen Road on the right-hand side, it had all windows all around, and it was that was the dining room.
Oh.
The patients that were allowed to walk and were little freedom went over there for their meals.
Okay.
They didn't have to stay in their rooms and have them taken on a tray.
Helen, we have to take a little break here, but when we come back, we want to talk about your childhood in this area and around Ludlums, and your mother and being a nurse and your schooling, and we'll be right back.